Okay. Morning, everybody. My name is Patrick Kelly, a professor of zoology here at Cal State Stanislaus. Actually, this is not here. I'm coming in from my home in Clovis, California. And this is the virtual thesis seminar for my student, Celia Tarcha, this morning. Here's her master's in science for the ecology and MS in ecology and sustainability program at California State Stanislaus. So I'm so pleased to see so many of you logging in this morning to hear about Celia's research. This meeting is recording right now, and in a moment I'm going to share the screen with Celia as she presents her research. And the topic of her thesis is Behavior and Ecology of Riparian Bush Rabbits as determined by camera traps. So I'd like to hand it over to Celia now, who's going to tell you about the behavior and ecology of riparian bush rabbits. It's all yours, Celia. So.
All right, let me share the screen. All right, thank you so much for attending. Hello, my name is Celia Tarcha, a graduate student here at CSU Stanislaus, and welcome to my talk on my research on the behavior and ecology of the riparian brush rabbit as determined by camera traps. So my project had three major questions regarding their behavior. The first being, do riparian brush rabbits have a defined activity period? The second being, what typical activities are representative of their behavioral repertoire? As well as, do riparian brush rabbits interact with other species, and how do they interact with other species? And for these questions, I had three hypotheses. The first, that riparian brush rabbit will show a predominantly crepuscular activity pattern. The second being that their behavioral repertoire will be primarily defined by solitary behaviors. And third, that they'll interact amicably with potentially beneficial species and conversely aggressively with potential competitors. The riparian brush rabbit, Civilagus bachmani riparius, will also be referred to as RBR in this presentation. It's a subspecies of brush rabbit that was described by Orr in 1940, primarily based on its differing morphology of its skull. It has the other features of typical brush rabbits, that being a very small tail, as well as unmarked ears that are primarily almost uniform in color, as seen here in this photograph. The riparian brush rabbit is a cryptic specialist of the San Joaquin riparian habitats. It's tied to the vegetation cover of these densely vegetated areas, very rarely straying far from the vegetation cover that provides it both protection and food. As it's tied to these habitats, and as the Central Valley has been developed for agriculture and urban expansion, the riparian brush rabbit has lost most of its habitat, and in 2000 was declared as endangered by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. Since then, starting in the early 2000s, there were two major programs started to help the riparian brush rabbit. The first being habitat restoration at the San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge, and the second being a captive breeding program, taking individuals from the population in the nearby Caswell Memorial State Park and reintroducing them to the San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge. And my study will primarily focus on this population at the San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge during the 2017 flood event a few years ago. This flood was very special in that it inundated most of the refuge grounds, stranding all wildlife onto levees and small islands. Due to this concentration of herbivores, the vegetation was quickly exhausted, leading to an opening for the invasive poison hemlock, Conium maculatum, to take over the area of the foraging area of the riparian brush rabbit. And this flooding extended mostly through February and March. However, the floodwaters did not start to recede until July. And because of the lack of food available for the riparian brush rabbit and the risk of toxic exposure through poison hemlock, the refuge started distributing alfalfa from February 2017 through August 2017. The main method of my study was using passive infrared camera traps to collect photographs of the riparian brush rabbit, especially during this flood period. The survey was set from February to August 2017 with cameras on the ground to collect at least 1 week's worth of data a month. The camera traps that were used were the Cuddyback Black Flash E3 camera, this very small camera here. It was set for 5 photos per trigger in order to maximize the capture of very fast behaviors of these rabbits. The way the camera was set was for a lateral view of the area and point of interest in order to get a side view of the riparian brush rabbit. This was done for maximizing the capture and identification of behaviors, as well as helping identify it against the very similar looking desert cottontail. And there were 8 sites in total. 3 of these were actually established before the flood happened in my preliminary study, which had originally 48 camera sites, but the floodwaters inundated 45 of those sites. The 3 that survived were included within this survey. The other 5 sites were started in February as poison hemlock had dominated the sites. And so we had 3 different types of sites in this study. And to give some context, the San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge is an urban wildlife refuge about 30 minutes west of Modesto. And it's primarily surrounded by agricultural fields. In terms of its placement in California, it is within the Central Valley. It has a lot of area that's distributed along the river, and my study is right in the center off of its main visitor entrance. So the main entrance for this refuge is right here for visitors. And my study was taking place on the 2 levees, the one along Hospital Creek, a remnant creek and remnant riparian habitat, and the second part on the Vieira levee. Note that this photo was taken in May 2017. The black in this photograph is all water that has flooded this grassland, which had a bunch of berms that were vegetated for the riparian brush rabbit. This was also the only area open to visitors. And so for establishing the new sites, they had the additional criteria of not being able to be seen by the extra visitor traffic going through. And because of this, and the criteria of having to have either alfalfa, poison hemlock, or runways present, this set them at a very unequal distribution across the levee. There was also my live observation area here in the meadow where I would observe riparian brush rabbits live and take photographs in order to understand what these behaviors look like when they're captured in the still photographs of the camera traps. And so for the camera sites, there were once again 3 types. The first being the remnant sites from my preliminary study. These were called the runway sites. They were Run 7, Run B1, and Run B2. And these sites were mainly set because they had runways for the riparian brush rabbits used at the time, as well as a lack of food in the forage area. As you can see with this riparian brush rabbit standing in B1, all of the foliage is above its head, even standing, so it cannot access the food. And this green right here is actually water that's covered in duckweed from the flood. Before the flood, this camera was facing a rose bush as well as a trail, which had been inundated in February. The second site type was poison hemlock. The poison hemlock sites only had poison hemlock dominating the forage area, with the rest of the plants being unedible, such as this elderberry. And these included 2 sites, pH1 and pH2. And here, seen in pH2, you can see a riparian brush rabbit that's surrounded by the poison hemlock. The third type of site was the alfalfa sites. These were sites that had alfalfa pre-existing from the refuge distributions when I was surveying for camera sites. The alfalfa was not placed in these sites in particular. It was pre-existing when the sites were established, so animals were already familiar with its location. And these included pH3, pH4, and pH5. pH3 is seen pictured here, where we have an alfalfa pile with a riparian brush rabbit, desert cottontail, and 2 California quails all feeding on it. And this also had poison hemlock in the area. After the cameras took their photographs, the photographs were processed within the program Photomechanic made by Camera Bits Incorporated. With this program, I was tagging the photos with additional metadata aside from time and date. And the tag system was included the taxa that were present, the animal species that were present, if there were riparian brush rabbits, the number of riparian brush rabbits, any behaviors displayed by the riparian brush rabbit, as well as if they were interacting with their own conspecifics, it would be tagged as intraspecific. If they were interacting with a other species, then it would be tagged as interspecific. If they had interacted with a plant in the photograph, that plant species would also be included in the tags. So for example, this photograph here of a riparian brush rabbit eating California blackberry while standing would be tagged as mammal, lagomorph, riparian brush rabbit, stand, feed, and California blackberry. And although this looks like a simple process in the beginning, it actually had some more complex photos, such as this one pictured here. So in this photograph, there's 3 animals present. They're all mammals. 2 of them are lagomorphs, and 1 is a rodent. The 2 lagomorphs are riparian brush rabbits, and the rodent is a California ground squirrel. And as there's 2 riparian brush rabbits, the tag 2 would be included. And as for behaviors, since the riparian brush rabbit is leaping aggressively at the California ground squirrel, the aggression tag is included, as well as the vigilant tag for the second riparian brush rabbit, with its ears perked up, its eyes open, standing vigilant, either looking at the California ground squirrel or the other riparian brush rabbit or the event in front of it. It's just the individual behavior that's included. And then this actually has 2 behavior types. It has intraspecific, just based on the proximity between the 2 rabbits, and also interspecific because of their behaviors against the California ground squirrel. So vigilance, while in the presence of a different species, was always considered interspecific for this study, and as well as for intraspecific being whether the riparian brush rabbits were within 2 meters of each other. And all of these tags would be exported from Photomechanic and imported into Microsoft Excel, where they would appear like this line, a set of data with all of the times, dates, as well as all the tags here: mammal, lagomorph, riparian brush rabbit, 2 intra, multiple for multiple species aside from riparian brush rabbit, rodent, California ground squirrel, aggression, inter, and vigilance. So once all of the data was imported into Microsoft Excel, it was cleaned up for typos as well as rearranged for ease of visual distinction. And from that, Excel was doing most of the calculations, but instead of keeping all of the data together and calculating it in the same spreadsheet, it was actually copied and separated into multiple databases using the Q Tools for Excel add-on. So for example, for calculating activities, that was in a separate database with all of the rest photos and active photos kept together. So for instance, rest photos, such as this one highlighted in pink, would be selected by Q Tools and then copied and pasted over to the new database, where since it's only looking at activities and time, the time and date would be kept and the time rounded to the nearest hour. And with all these hours rounded, that would go into the activity calculations for the number of photos taken at that hour period. For behavior and the number of rabbits present, Q Tools could also select lines with, say, riparian brush rabbit and copy and paste it over to a database that would just have photo entries with riparian brush rabbits. So the results of my study initially, there were 105,777 photos collected, and brush rabbits were photographed in all sites and at all times of the day and night. And of that 105,000 photos, a little under 69,000 had animals present. And of that 69,000, a little over 44,000 had riparian brush rabbit present. And another interesting thing was that riparian brush rabbits, aside from being photographed throughout the day and night, were also photographed over the seasons, even in the same sites as they were changing. For instance, these photographs here at pH1, we see the rabbit here, where the floodwaters have flooded all of his trail and his meadow. And so this was before this, it was a visitor trail that people could walk on all seasons, no flooding. And for the 2017 flood, it had about a foot of water right here. And this riparian brush rabbit is standing on the banks. However, a month later, we capture on camera a riparian brush rabbit now being able to stand off of that new bank as the water has receded. However, it's not completely receded. We can see it in the background here. And then in another month, we can see how the floodwaters have mostly receded and the land has begun to really dry out as summer has approached. And so for the first hypothesis looking at activity, the number of photographs taken per hour for each hour from all the sites were averaged together to create this activity chart. And despite there being a lot of photographs taken at all the sites, there's not a defined pattern of crepuscular, nocturnal, or diurnal activity. And additionally, these peaks have a very high variance to them, a lot of variance, versus the troughs that have very low variance. And what this might say is these peaks may not be the most accurate representation of riparian brush rabbit activity at the time, and that these smaller troughs may actually be a bit more accurate to what their activity would be. And this might be because of the flood concentrating all the animals at the same site. It may have just created more photographs and inflated the numbers, especially as we'll see that sites had different amounts of photos with them. And so to further investigate and try to decipher whether there was an activity pattern, the photographs were separated into events rather than individual photos. So since there were 5 photos taken per trigger, what this would do is if within those 5 photos there was a riparian brush rabbit active, it would be counted as one event to try to remove that inflation. And as that event had a time associated with it, it it would be put into one of 4 categories: day, night, dawn, or dusk, depending on when the time would fall for those periods on that date in Modesto. And so initially it looks like maybe diurnal, maybe nocturnal, across the board. It could be anything because there's no real pattern. But part of it may be because the hour ranges for day versus dawn are very different. The day period, there could be 12 hours represented of activity versus dawn could be a maximum, maybe 2. And another interesting thing is, despite the amounts being very different, the rates of events is very similar for some of these values. For instance, day and dusk, for day it has 172 events per hour and dusk 164. So not a big difference between them. And running in ANOVA, there was no significant difference, even when dawn and dusk were combined as a single unit against day and night. All right, and so another method to try to decipher whether there is an activity pattern for the riparian brush rabbit was to do the reverse and look at their rest periods. And rest was not captured as much as activity. So the rest photographs, when they were given the same treatment, turned into events and then placed within these 4 categories of day, night, dawn, and dusk. It had a very similar proportion to the activity, despite being significantly different. It was not inverse of activity as I had thought it would be. And once again, it doesn't look either nocturnal, diurnal, or crepuscular. And so for looking at rest on the 24-hour scale, with all the photographs together, there was not a distinctive pattern at all. And I additionally looked as well at 2 different resting postures to try to decipher activity pattern again. And so seen here, we have the 2 postures that were tagged with photos, laying down, seen in light gray, and sitting while resting with ears back and eyes mostly closed. That would be represented with the dark bars. And interestingly, the laying down was mainly captured during the day hours, which suggests that this is more associated with thermal regulation over sleep. And when we're looking at this pattern against the average for activity, it's once again kind of similar. It's not the exact inverse of activity, which it could mean that rest may not be able to help us understand activity when our activity data doesn't tell us the descriptive, definitive answer on patterns. Or it may also state that for rest, we need a lot more photographs in order to tell if there's a rest pattern or activity pattern. Going to behavior, there were a total of 24 behaviors captured within this study. And of those 24 behaviors captured, vigilant was captured the most. It represented 36% of all the behaviors captured, with forage coming in at 20% after. And vigilant, it was captured a little under 20,000 times, 20,000 photographs to represent what 36% is. And interestingly, most of the social behaviors seen here are underneath 700, 800 photos, versus all the exploratory behaviors are making up predominantly most of the repertoire. And direct interactions were also some of the least captured behaviors, as well as the aggression of riparian brush rabbits was near third to last captured. When looking at behavior by interaction type, that being intraspecific between 2 riparian brush rabbits, interspecific between a riparian brush rabbit and another species. An individual, where the riparian brush rabbit is just doing its own thing, you'll note that the individual behavior is the predominant of riparian brush rabbit behaviors across all sites and when all the sites are averaged together, with intraspecific coming in second at 30%. Another interesting thing to note is based on the site type, there were different proportions of individual to intra and interspecific behaviors captured. And for the alfalfa sites, it had more intraspecific and interspecific interactions, possibly because as the only real food source in the area that was easily accessible, it probably brought in more herbivorous species together, as well as attracted more predators. Another interesting thing is that the poison hemlock sites and the runway sites, they near mirror each other. And this tells us that the poison hemlock sites to the riparian brush rabbits were treated a lot like the runway sites, more as a transit site over a feeding site, which, considering the toxic properties of the poison hemlock, is a good thing that we know that they weren't eating a lot of it. And then looking at individual and intraspecific interactions closely, there was a primarily differing amount of photographs captured at the different sites once again. So photographs like this one at pH 3, where there's many rabbits present, over 3 riparian brush rabbits present, those were only captured in alfalfa sites, although very rarely as the flood continued and the alfalfa was depleted. However, another thing to note is that most of the rabbit photos were captured in the alfalfa, but the runways came second over poison hemlock. Whereas the runway sites are pretty empty, there's not a lot of cover aside from the canopy. It's interesting that the poison hemlock sites, which would offer more cover just from dense foliage, do not have as many riparian brush rabbit photos captured. And then, so despite the social activities not being the predominant behaviors captured in this study, a lot of social and reproductive behaviors were captured, expanding from just territorial behaviors such as marking and fighting to social behaviors such as smelling conspecifics and doing what we call a nose touch. And then also reproductive behaviors such as pre-mating behaviors, actual mating behaviors, and nesting. So an interesting thing that had happened in this study was that not only were riparian brush rabbits captured mating, but they were also captured collecting bundles of vegetation, presumably for nests, as this is their nesting season. As in this photo, we can see a riparian brush rabbit carrying some rose twigs, and similar photos at pH 5 captured the same rabbit pulling different bundles of vegetation back and forth to its nest site out of the camera's area over a couple hours. And this site included alfalfa, which was included in the rabbit's bundles, suggesting that the alfalfa was being used as a nesting material in addition to food. And because they were also using the alfalfa as food, and more interestingly, climbing the bales of alfalfa that were thrown from Fish and Wildlife trucks, captured here at pH 4. The rabbits were climbing around the coyote brush in some of the sites to access the canopy, but with these large bales of alfalfa, they were climbing up top onto them as well to eat, which was interesting considering how exposed they are. And despite there being seemingly plenty of alfalfa in these sites, where you would think that the riparian brush rabbit would only be eating the alfalfa, they were still interacting with poison hemlock, either eating it or sampling it, and at times carrying it away in bundles, also assumed for nesting. So with the community interactions, I mainly looked at co-occurrence photos. Co-occurrence photos were photographs where there was a riparian brush rabbit and another species present. And of the co-occurrent photos, there were about 4,898 co-occurrent photos captured. And of that number, a little over 4,000 were with desert cottontail. So the majority of the co-occurrence photos were with the riparian brush rabbit's competitor, the desert cottontail. Coming in second and third were co-occurrence photos with California quail, which would be assumed to be a beneficial species for their ability to talk to one another and communicate distress and alarm. And the California ground squirrel assumed to be a competitor for its similar herbivory interactions. And I think to note with these is that the co-occurrence didn't always mean that there was an interaction. Photographs were further looked at to see if co-occurrent photos had an interaction or if no interaction had taken place. And for interaction photos and no interaction, they were pretty similar in proportion, with interaction a little more common. And this may be partially inflated due to the photographs of riparian brush rabbit vigilance. Any co-occurrence photograph where the riparian brush rabbit was vigilant was considered an interaction, it being vigilant in response to the other species present. However, it is interesting, once again, that they are near similar in terms of number for interaction and no interaction. And once again, the alfalfa sites had the most interspecific interaction, possibly just because of the food source. We can see here in this photograph the riparian brush rabbit, 3 of them eating from an alfalfa pile while a quail foraged nearby. And this was mainly common in the alfalfa sites. However, the most interactions were with the desert cottontail. And as I stated before, a little over 4,000 photographs of concurrence were with desert cottontail. And of that 4,000, 2,232 photographs were of riparian brush rabbits vigilance while concurrently occurring with desert cottontails. And so for this, it shows that pretty much the primary interaction between the two was riparian brush rabbits being vigilant, and that aggression as well as chasing were on the lower spectrum. Aggression towards desert cottontails was rarely captured. It was only captured in 5 photographs. And so back to my hypotheses. The first regarding whether they will show a predominantly crepuscular pattern. This was pretty much unsupported. There was no defined pattern that could be seen from both of my calculations. And so this may be possibly that due to the flood period, with all of the animals concentrated with each other, the riparian brush rabbit may have not had a chance to rest. There were probably more predator pressure in the area, as well as the riparian brush rabbit most likely having to forage more for food since food was scarce. And of course, it could also be that the cameras may have not been in areas conducive to riparian brush rabbit sleep, as they were on the levees, and they may not be using those as resting areas. Regarding whether the repertoire is defined by solitary behaviors, this is mostly supported by most of the behaviors being captured, being vigilance, feeding, foraging, which are solitary behaviors, as well as the low count of aggression and agnostic behaviors and other interactions with its conspecifics. And for whether riparian brush rabbit interact amicably with potentially beneficial species, this is unsupported more for the lack of data. There was not enough photographs taken with potentially beneficial species, as well as regarding regression, there was very low aggression captured. However, 5 photographs versus near 2,000, it may not have been that the sites were in areas where riparian brush rabbits are aggressive with their competitor, or it may be that the presence of riparian brush rabbits may not be conducive to desert cottontails being present. However, this also suggests, conversely, that riparian brush rabbits may just be primarily a passive species, as there was very low aggression, even between other species at the food sites with alfalfa. There wasn't really any territorial displays, aside from that one photograph of the riparian brush rabbit leaping at the California ground squirrel. It was a very rare photograph. So they may just be a passive species, which could be good in these situations, that they won't be hoarding all the food from all the other herbivores. So aside from answering the hypotheses, this study found some other interesting things to know about riparian brush rabbits, especially regarding their responses to floods. From this study, we found that they have forage flexibility. Before this project, there were a lot of trapping attempts for riparian brush rabbits that were unsuccessful, possibly because of the bait. One of the bait studies done on riparian brush rabbits by Basie in 1990 tested 11 different baits and found one being of a slight preference to riparian brush rabbits, but overall they seem to be a species that is avoidant of novelty. And so there was a possible risk of them not utilizing this new forage. However, they did utilize the alfalfa very readily. And although unfortunately they were interacting with the non-native poison hemlock. And for both, they were also collecting them seemingly for nesting material, which from a management perspective, for the alfalfa, it does state that it may be a very good forage or choice for forage to go back to, especially if these flood periods happen during the reproductive period. So then the riparian brush rabbits will have not only a food source, but also a source of nesting material, especially since the grasslands tend to be flooded during these large floods. And they also show flood resilience in that they were making nests and presumably having young during a time where there was a food shortage and high stress from concentration of predators, as well as also climbing to access food. Their climbing behaviors have only really been documented for escaping from floodwaters and often ending up stranded because of them, and rarely captured using their climbing abilities to access food. However, these photographs did capture them climbing coyote brush to access the canopy, as well as climbing, on my live observation, climbing quail bush to access quail bush leaves that were growing above their forage line. So it may state that climbing may be a more common behavior than previously thought, and possibly that management should look at how the plant growth is in these areas that are flood refuges, and whether the plants have a growth form that's conducive to riparian brush rabbits climbing into their canopies in case the forage on the ground is exhausted. And so as well, another interesting thing about these results is what they had shown about the relationship between the lagomorph species at San Joaquin Refuge. San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge is very special in that it has 3 lagomorphs present. The black-tailed jackrabbit, the riparian brush rabbit, and the desert cottontail. And so looking at the 3 of them, they're morphologically very different. The grassland specialist, black-tailed jackrabbit, has a very elongated body, large tail, is very big and white, that's black on the top, as well as large ears that are very black. And compared to, say, a generalist like the desert cottontail, it does have a big white tail, and the dark-tipped ears, but it's a smaller body, not as small as the riparian brush rabbit, more of an in-between, which is conducive to its habit of going into dense brush, as well as being out in the grasslands. As desert cottontail is a generalist, you can pretty much find them anywhere on the refuge. And it's not rare for jackrabbits to be seen on the levees. It's just that they weren't captured during this study. And also, while looking at the riparian brush rabbits compared to these other species, it is an extremely compact body compared to the jackrabbit. A very small tail, small ears, and near uniform coloration. No black tipped ears and no black on the tail. And looking at these three species, it goes from conspicuous to inconspicuous, with the riparian brush rabbits having very muted features. And this coincides with a study on lagomorph coloration by Stoner, Beninda, Emmons, and Caro in 2003. Looking at lagomorph species all over the world, they determined that the coloration of extremities are more associated with sociality than with the environment. For instance, white tails are used to communicate flight to conspecifics, as well as black-tipped ears can communicate to conspecifics and different things. However, you'll note in the riparian brush rabbit, these features are all muted. There's no black tips for intraspecific communication. And although they still have the white on the tail to alert others of their same species, it's very muted, it's small. And so this is very interesting as it does coincide with the lack of behaviors, of intraspecific behaviors between riparian brush rabbit compared to the solitary behaviors. And it may suggest a more solitary lifestyle morphologically as well as based on the captured behaviors. And furthermore, looking at the relationship between the riparian brush rabbit and the flood, an interesting thing is that this flood may be where the riparian brush rabbit has an advantage. Typically, the desert cottontail, since it can be out in the open and as well as deep in the brush, it's more prolific than the riparian brush rabbit. And typically, it dominates the site compared to the riparian brush rabbit. However, during the flood period, population surveys were finding a decrease in desert cottontails over time and an increased dominance of the riparian brush rabbit, which comparatively looking at the size of them, it may have been that the desert cottontail requires more food and thus was the first to decrease in population as the food became scarce. It also behaviorally is very different from the riparian brush rabbit. The desert cottontail will be out in the open and often won't flee when you approach. Sometimes they'll even climb into vehicles, chew on wires, get into trouble, and that kind of thing. However, with riparian brush rabbit, they don't stray far from the brush, and when you get near them, they'll run. And typically, you'll never see a riparian brush rabbit sunning itself out in the open. You'll see it underneath at least a little bit of canopy of brush. And this may play into the survival during the flood, that the bolder species would be picked off first by predators, and the more shy small one has the advantage of evading predation, especially when predators are concentrated on a smaller amount of land. So this may suggest that the riparian brush rabbit, where it doesn't have an advantage during normal times, has all the advantage during flood periods, and that's its adaptation and its niche compared to these other two species of rabbit. And overall, this really tells us that even though we see different lagomorph species as being similar, they're all herbivores, they kind of look the same, that they may have very different behaviors and socialities than each other. And we should look more into their different nuanced adaptations. And with that, I'd like to thank a lot of good people. The first, thank you so much to the Department of Biological Sciences and CSU Stanislaus. Camera Bits Incorporated, thank you so much for the donation of the photomechanic license. A very special thanks to Scott Phillips for all his help in Excel, especially with those time calculations. and Bernadette Paul for helping me with all of the materials for this project. And also thanks to recently graduated student Rachel Devon for her help with my vegetation data. And a very special thanks to my committee, Matt Lloyd, Dr. Fleming, Dr. Gerson, and Dr. Kelly, as well as a very special thanks to the San Luis National Wildlife Refuge Complex for all their work and support. Thank you so much for listening to my talk, and I leave it now to Dr. Kelly.
Okay, I'm gonna take over here. All right, thank you, Celia. That was a very nice presentation. So we will open the meeting up to public questions now for Celia about her presentation. So I can unmute microphones, or actually probably best for anyone who wants to speak to raise their hands, and I'll try to see them and ask questions of Celia for the next 10 minutes or so. So anybody got some questions for Celia? If you unmute your microphone, I will try to see it. Anybody? Okay, got any questions here? Any questions, anyone? Okay, well, I have a question for Celia to at least set the ball rolling here. Celia, were you to continue this study, what would be your next step?
The next step for this study?
Yeah.
Would possibly look at the photos again, looking at the desert cottontail photos to determine if they're experiencing the same thing during the floods. Even maybe looking at their behavior to look at the two lagomorphs comparatively. Additionally, looking at the next step of technology, there's now photograph programs for sorting videos, as well as photographs like photomechanic. So the next step would be doing video behavior surveys, possibly not during a flood, because we still don't have their behavior collected during a seemingly normal time. And so we don't know if the results of this study could easily apply to all times.
Right. Okay. Okay. Anybody else out there got any questions for Celia?
I have a question.
Abigail, okay.
Was there anything that you found that surprised you going through the photos?
Probably the most surprising was the nesting materials being collected. I didn't even have a tag for collecting nesting material. I didn't expect it to happen. Mating was something where it's like, oh, cool, they're still mating, but the collecting of nesting material, which said that they were successful and all right with trying to carry out raising their young despite the flood, that was a very interesting thing to learn, especially seeing that they were collecting species that could be identified, and as well as the one event where there was a rabbit passing in front of PH5 for over an hour collecting a bundle going back and forth, which suggested that that site that I had been visiting all those months had potentially baby rabbits running around in a nest nearby, which I completely missed and never noticed. So that would probably be one of the most surprising things.
Oh wow, that is interesting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Anybody else who'd like to ask a question?
I have a question.
Lelena, fire away.
What was the hardest hurdle you had to get over through your project?
Man, there's a lot of hurdles. I guess probably one of the biggest hurdles, the first one was so originally this project was it was assumed that the amount of photos I would collect would be around not even 50,000, more like a 5,000, just because during the preliminary surveys, riparian brush rabbits were rarely captured on camera. Every time I saw one, it was very exciting. But then once the camera started during the flood and suddenly they were getting maxed out at 8,000, 9,000 photos per week per camera, the first big hurdle was learning how to deal with way more data than was expected. Because it was expected that riparian brush rabbits would be rarely captured, so even my statistics were set to be non-parametric for there being very few photographs. And suddenly my project is the exact opposite, where pretty much most of the photographs I'm encountering not only have one riparian brush rabbit, but at times 5, 10, which my original database and tagging system was not created for. So the first big hurdle, and probably the biggest one, was figuring out how to make sense of these Excel lines that had near 20 tags at times and how to calculate that. So that was probably one of the biggest hurdles that took the longest during my project.
If I could interject for a moment, I probably should have said at the start of question time that it would be helpful, since this is a Zoom meeting, if you could identify yourself and your background, whether you're a student or a professional biologist or whatever, when you start to ask a question. So Lelena and Abigail, if you briefly want to introduce yourself to the group here. We've got over 24 people involved in this seminar right now. Abigail, do you want to go first and say who you are or what you do?
Sure. I'm a friend of Celia's. I worked with her at U.S. Fish and Wildlife for last summer, and I'm currently a student at Fresno State, master's student.
Great, welcome. And Lelena, you'd like to tell us who you are? I know, but nobody else, some other people don't.
Yeah, I'm a current student at CSU Stanislaus, hopefully graduating this semester. And I've also applied for the master's program there, so.
No, hopefully about it. You're graduating, of course. Okay, anybody else got a question for Celia?
I do, Pat.
Okay, Matt. Welcome to Matt Lloyd. Well, you definitely have to introduce yourself.
So I'm Matt Lloyd. I'm the deputy project leader at Willapa National Wildlife Refuge in Washington State. I spent almost a decade having Pat yell at me while I did brush rabbit work. And
really?
So I used to be a professional biologist. Now I'm a wildlife refuge manager, so I just do paperwork. But I do have a question for Celia. And that question would be, coming from that refuge management perspective, if you had to come up with like a list of bullets to provide recommendations so that San Luis Complex can appropriately respond to future flood events, what would you recommend to benefit the brush rabbits?
To benefit, definitely have alfalfa, know where a source of alfalfa is, since that seems to have a dual usage to the riparian brush rabbit. And additionally, also set aside a list of priorities for data collection during the flood period, especially since with the riparian brush rabbit, it's rare that you can really count them. And one of the things that they did was, which was really nice, was their population surveys along the levee, where they were counting the number of riparian brush rabbits, desert cottontail, and the black-tailed jackrabbit. That was actually a very good survey because it showed the difference in proportion over time. Because there was a point with my photographs where I was very confused because I was capturing so many riparian brush rabbits and no desert cottontails. And so that added that extra insight. Additionally, just doing basic data collection, such as genetic data collection, as a lot of rabbits were getting stranded and they do go out and save them. If you have them in hand, have a set priorities of data for collection. Especially too, I've heard that there were areas where there were islands with lots of dead rabbits. Just taking photographs in a set standard way so you can count them after. As dark as it sounds, even counting dead individuals does give you insight as to how many riparian brush rabbits were present. And I would think since the riparian brush rabbit, it is a species that's defined by its skull morphology, probably collecting more voucher specimens to make up for the loss of these individuals of the species. And that would be some major bullets that I found with this project.
Okay, it looks like I've got 2 people in the queue with questions. I'm not sure who's in order here, so I will, I think Brian is next, Brian Seifert.
Let's see. Yeah, I'll pop in there.
Hey.
Hey, Celia, nice job, very nice job.
Thank you.
So I'm currently the director for the Endangered Species Recovery Program. I primarily work with critters that eat rabbits, but so of course I like to see good healthy rabbit populations because of that. But anyway, I was kind of curious about your finding that, you know, I guess just about the behavior patterns. You know, when you think about rabbits, particularly smaller species like that, you know, the general conception is that they're primarily crepuscular, but that's not what you found. And I think it'd be interesting to take a look at your data maybe, and maybe have some thoughts about this, to basically do that same analysis for the desert cottontails. Because I'm kind of wondering whether what you saw was maybe a behavioral or an activity shift to avoid competition, direct competition with the desert cottontails. But you could easily, you know, look at that just by doing that same analysis for the desert cottontails. But have any thoughts about that?
Yes, especially since the desert cottontail, it's hard to say that maybe they weren't going to the alfalfa piles because maybe riparian brush rabbit being present kind of just keeps them away. Whether they avoid each other, like answering the question of whether they avoid each other would probably be easier if the desert cottontail data set was also looked at with the same methods as the riparian brush rabbit data set, as well as seeing if the desert cottontail, I didn't see them collecting nesting material, but that may have been because I'm locked on looking for riparian brush rabbits. And additionally, also looking at the predator patterns, seeing a separate data set with that to see if maybe the 2 rabbits, there's no difference in their behavior during this time period, or maybe it's more of avoidance due to predator pressure. Since predators such as coyotes were captured during the study, especially visiting some of the sites like PH4 was visited over time a lot more by coyotes, because there was about 2 packs in the area. So, but looking at the lagomorph species, the only thing that's a problem is that the jackrabbit was never captured. So, but just the relationship between the desert cottontail and riparian brush rabbit, I think would reveal a lot more about both species, kind of looking at them comparatively a lot deeper.
Okay.
Okay.
We have, oh, sorry, did you say something, Brian?
I'm good, thanks.
Okay, we got one last question then from, I think Dan Appleby has got his hand up virtually.
Yeah, hi. First of all, great job, Celia. My name's Dan Appleby. I work for California Department of Fish and Wildlife in the non-game program. We are exploring the kind of camera trap work you've done for a number of species, and I was just curious if you had any automated way to review the photos, or if you had to actually get your eyes on all 105,000 photos. And then if I may, just a little quick side question, just curious if you detected any species on the refuge that was a surprise to the refuge staff or to yourself.
So to answer the second one first, the most surprising species was the capture of riparian wood rat, especially in areas that were quite far from the riparian area on that one Vieira levee, as well as the capture of off-leash dogs, which was surprising because a lot of people, either the dog parks nearby were closed or something, but there were a lot of off-leash dogs that were captured with the cameras. And that was actually another beneficial thing with the cameras being present was it was unexpected. And then I could tell Eric that, hey, I've been noticing a lot of off-leash dogs, and they were able to put up more signs to help curb that problem. So those were the main unexpected species. And in terms of the first question, I don't want to break your heart, but I went through the photos manually. And mainly it's because I didn't use volunteers because the riparian brush rabbit looks so similar to the desert cottontail that I was trying to keep the same person, distinguishing between the two of them, which was very unfortunate since there were a lot of photos. Generally, they do have those photo sorting programs that they've used for, I think, tigers and ocelots, species that look very distinctive on a camera, and they have distinctive patterns that an AI can pick up. And since the riparian brush rabbit blends into its own environment so well, I didn't look too deep into those, especially since there's a bit of a cost associated. But if you had volunteers to go through, if my photos, the ones where there were lots of riparian brush rabbits present, those probably took the longest to get through. So 6,000 photos could take weeks to go through as a single person because you have multiple individuals that are all doing different things. But if it was to be done during a period where there's not that high concentration, it could go pretty quick. However, it's pretty much manual labor, unfortunately. Best done with having dual screen cameras or dual screen monitors. And one of the things that I did like with the photo mechanic program was that I could have on a separate screen 2 photographs side by side where I can zoom in on different parts of them. And that was really good for comparing the photos to see if that was riparian brush rabbit or desert cottontail. But yes, it's still a lot of manual work just because of how the species is morphologically.
I'm sorry, impressive on your part.
Thank you.
I was muted there for a moment. We're running out of time for the public part of the presentation, but I have a request for one quick meeting from Jen Rippert, who has worked on brush rabbit genetics, and I'll allow in one quick question with a quick answer, hopefully, from Celia. Jen, the floor is yours.
Hi all. Hi Celia.
Hello.
Hopefully this will be a quick question, a quick answer. If not, feel free to email. We can take it offline. But based on what you've learned about your behavior, brush rabbit behavior, if we could start fresh with a new population, captive propagation, what would you advise we think about in design and in plan and implementation? Kind of building from where Matt was coming from.
Well, unfortunately with my study, I couldn't tell the difference between age groups, juveniles versus adults. Definitely, it's a stumping question. Behavior-wise, I would think to definitely look at having a mixture of individuals being released at different ages, especially more in what they were having those outdoor propagation pens rather than in enclosed environments in like a little cage or a carrier. Mainly so they can get a lot of like usage and familiar with the type of sites that they grow up in, especially since they do seem to climb possibly as a somewhat regular adaptation to access food, more so they can work on those abilities. So when they are fully released, that there is a, that they have all those tools already, and it's going to be a lot more of a soft release than a hard one. I saw with your study that they're still pretty genetically diverse. So I guess if we were to start with a new population, possibly maybe collect individuals from both Caswell and San Joaquin, probably with a little bit of strict genetic work to make sure that they are different, but it looks like that they are fairly different, where we could get a healthy population going from collecting individuals from different sites.
Okay. I hate to call a halt here, but I'm afraid we have run out of time. And so I need to thank everybody for attending, and to thank Celia for a wonderful presentation. And we need to close the public part of this seminar right now. And Celia and her committee are going to get together and to discuss her presentation, and we will take it from there. So thank you everybody else who joined us for the last hour. A wonderful question time too. So if you want to give a virtual round of applause to Celia, you can turn your mics on if you want for that. That'd be great.
Good job.
Thanks, Celia.
Good job.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Good.
Bye, Rachel.
Bye,
Right.
Ray.
It takes two